Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I'm delighted to be hosting this program where we're going to get into the big picture, specifically involving North Korea, the so-called hermit kingdom, the country that brutalizes its own people and threatens many of the rest of us. We're going to talk today with one of our country's, and I think one of the world's, leading authorities on North Korea, a man who has devoted much of his life, his professional career, and his energies towards not only understanding and helping the rest of us recognize the challenges that we face from North Korea, but also to see what he can do to help free the people of North Korea from the brutal Kim Dynasty. His name is Greg Scarlatoiu. He is the executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. It's an important organization specializing in both the plight of the people of North Korea and what we might do about it. Greg Scarlatoiu, it's terrific to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Frank, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
We have very few examples, it seems to me, of somebody who has come to have your expertise about this faraway and very isolated nation. Tell us how it is that you came to be an expert on North Korea from as unlikely a place as I can think of, the former communist nation of Romania.
Frank, I would begin by respectfully disagreeing that I'm an expert. I'm still a student of Korean Peninsula affairs, and there's still a lot to learn. I'm a naturalized American, and I was actually born and raised in communist Romania under the Ceausescu regime. In December 1989, when the Ceausescu regime fell, I was right in the midst of it in Bucharest, a freshman, major in English language and literature at Bucharest University. I had never been outside Romania before that. Remember, after Ceausescu's first visit to Pyongyang in 1971, he and Kim Il-sung became best buddies, and he fell in love with the North Korean system, the worshipping of the dear and supreme leader, and really wanted to turn Romania into the North Korea of Eastern Europe. This was all life in the 1980s, dark power outages, water outages, food lines, you name it.
Repression.
Horrendous repression, absolutely. Romania opened up or began opening up in the early 1990s. And in March...
Initially under the thought that it could become a sort of alternative to the Soviet-style communism, right?
You're absolutely correct. Some of those actors who were at the very forefront of the Romanian Revolution were not exactly proponents of capitalism and freedom, democracy, and human rights as we know them. Those who were pushed aside. The transition was very difficult. The transitional justice process was not adequate. That's why Romania has such a hard time for such a long time. Yeah. Romanians had relations only with the North Koreans since 1949. So now they established relations with the South Koreans in March 1990. I had taken exams for scholarships abroad. I didn't think I was going to get a scholarship abroad, but I wrote one of my essays because I had been reading quite avidly about developmental models. I wrote one of my essays on the South Korean Han River miracle, the developmental model of South Korea that accelerated economic development. And it so happened that the newly established South Korean embassy in Bucharest got to see my paper and said, I would like this young man to become the first Romanian ever to study in South Korea. So I went to Seoul, first time outside Romania. I went through language training, BA and MA in international relations at Seoul National University. I worked there for a few years in media broadcasting. My wife is from Korea. She's also a naturalized American now, of course. Then we came here. I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy up at Tufts University in Massachusetts. And then I've been in D.C. since 2002, working in international development first, and then with the Korea Economic Institute, KEI, in Washington, D.C. And for more than 10 years now, I have been executive director of HRNK, the Washington, D.C.-based Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I hear this question quite often, Frank. Look, you don't look Korean to us. How come that you're doing this work? Well, it's a very personal mission. Especially because I've had this, I would say, interesting journey. I have been blessed to embark on this fulfilling, rewarding, journey for the past 31 years. And since I was born and raised in the one Eastern European country that was most similar to Kim Il-sung's North Korea, and since I lived for an entire decade, 10 years, on a divided Korean peninsula while studying, working, living in South Korea, this is a truly personal mission to me. I'm often asked, when are you going to do something else? For how long are you going to do this? And my answer is, for as long as it takes.
Good for you. The thing that I find so interesting about this, when I was a young man, I worked for Senator Scoop Jackson, who took a very profound interest in Romania, as it happens, because he bought into the idea that there might be an opportunity to take advantage of Romania's interest in relations with the West to actually relieve some of the suffering of your people, specifically that of dissidents. But you know what's particularly fascinating to me, Greg, about it, and it's relevant to our present topic, is we often hear, with respect to these totalitarian regimes, whether it's Putin's Russia or whether it's Xi's China or whether it's the Kim Dynasty in North Korea, that it's a permanent fact of life that these oppressive governments and persons will always rule. The fate of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife, who went from one moment to being the all-powerful eternal rulers of your country to being corpses, basically because the security state decided to turn on them, setting the stage for, as you say, a messy transition, but a transition nonetheless to something approaching a full-on democracy, must give you some hope as well for the work that you're doing for North Koreans.
Frank, absolutely, and thank you for your service back in the day when you were addressing those very important issues in Romania. I always say to myself that no dictatorship lasts forever. None of them are eternal. And as difficult as it might be, this will come to an end in North Korea as well. One fundamental difference between Romania, as oppressive as it was under Ceausescu, and North Korea today, is that prior to the communist takeover, Romanians had known other different political systems, some good, some bad, some terrible. However, Romanians had been accustomed with a modern constitution. They lived under a constitutional monarchy, a modern constitution, after all, inspired primarily by the Belgian constitution. Of course, then came terrible times in the 1930s, 1940s, and all the way until the late 1980s. But they had seen alternatives.
Yes.
In the case of North Korea, all they have witnessed has been totalitarian politics. Basically, Soviet Stalinist communism brought to North Korea by Kim Il-sung, who was at the time wearing a Soviet Red Army officer's uniform.
Right.
Prior to that, 40 years of brutal Japanese imperial occupation. Let me say it, I think that South Korea, Japan, and the United States are natural allies, friends, partners, and I hope Japan and Korea will find a way to reconcile with the past and get over all of these differences. But those are 40 years of Japanese occupation. Prior to that, 500 years of feudal Joseon dynasty. Again, a lot of wonderful things about the Joseon dynasty, but politically it was oppressive.
Yes.
It was an oppressive political system.
So there was no culture to aspire to even. Talk a little bit more about the character of the Kim dynasty and what that oppression means for not just the political system of Korea, North Korea, but of the human rights horrors that it inflicts on its people.
The fundamental objective of the Kim family regime is quite obvious, ensuring its own survival. What I'm just about to say might sound preposterous. The Kim family regime has no political competition inside North Korea. The only competition is the other South Korea. Rich, the world's 10th largest economy, a true economic powerhouse, a cultural powerhouse, this Hallyu, the South Korean wave, the Squid Game and all of the other series and movies and music and K-pop have taken the world by storm. So there's the Great Korea. For as long as the Great Korea continues to exist in its current shape and form, the Kim family regime will always regard it as the gravest threat to its very existence.
Which has bearing on a topic that we're going to discuss a little bit in our next segment with you, Greg. But before we get there, the ruthlessness with which the regime treats, well, not just the average individual in North Korea, but most especially those who have the temerity in any way to express their disillusionment or their dissatisfaction with the regime, and especially any that might be in a position to supplant it, few and far between that those are. Talk a little bit about the ruthlessness of this regime towards that sort of group of people with different sort of backgrounds and orientations, but a common destiny, it seems, as far as this regime is concerned.
The regime cracks down extraordinarily heavily on wrong thinkers, wrongdoers, those perceived as having engaged in wrong associations. How do you know who they are? Through a vast security apparatus. There are 3 internal security agencies in North Korea with a total of 270,000 agents.
For a population
of 25 million. Wow. Romania Securitate was 14,000 for a population of 23 million, comparable to North Korea today. There's of course, the Ministry of State.
And that was a pretty sustained and disciplined repression operation.
Yes, Frank. And remember, there were 500,000 informers in Romania. As it turned out later on, when documents were declassified. In North Korea, each and every person has to be an informer. Each and every
even
person,
against your family.
Even against your family, even against your neighbors. Each and every person has to participate in the Imminban neighborhood watch system. Each and every person has to participate in Senghwal Tonghwa, weekly ideological training sessions where you confess your trespasses for the previous week and you pledge to continue to recite the TPMI, the 10 Principles of Monolithic Ideology. Yes, North Korea
brainwashing, in short, of the first order.
Absolutely, Frank. North Korea has a constitution, laws that look, fairly decent on paper. It's acceded to international treaties that protect human rights. In reality, all North Koreans know is the 10 Principles of Monolithic Ideology, aiming to cement the supreme leader's grip on power. This is a country, this is a regime that is still running a political prison camp system. 120,000 men, women, and children held at political prison camps, subjected to an endless vicious cycle of forced labor, induced malnutrition, torture, public and secret executions. This is still happening today, just a few dozen kilometers north of the capital of South Korea, Seoul, the city of Seoul, in South Korea.
The DMZ. Yeah.
And what we have also found is that North Korea, of course, has a vast system of imprisonment. There are political prisoners held not only at these gulags, but also at other detention facilities. For example, re-education through labor camps. One example, there is one facility in the northeasternmost corner of North Korea, camp number 12, Cheonggori. 800 out of 1,000 women held there were forcibly repatriated by the Chinese regime in direct violation of the 1951 UN Convention concerning the status of refugees and the 1967 additional protocol. They were returned to a place where they faced a credible fear of persecution, and thus they should have been granted access to the process leading to gaining political refugee status. They didn't gain that access. They were sent back to North Korea, and obviously they're now political prisoners there being held at these re-education through labor facilities.
Yeah. And that's a euphemism, of course, for, as you say, the most horrific kinds of mistreatment of people. But let me ask you about China. You've mentioned that it's an enabler of this repression. It is the essential underpinning of the Korean regime and the so-called DPRK. It's not conceivable, is it, that brutal, repressive, backwards nation, albeit one with a increasingly formidable nuclear arsenal and military capabilities of other kinds, would be in business today were it not for its being propped up by the Chinese Communist Party?
Absolutely. On multiple levels. All one has to do is look at a map of North Korea. Most of the northern border of North Korea is its border with China, just about 17 kilometers of border with the Russian Federation. Perhaps China does not have the capability to transform North Korea, nor does it have the will to transform North Korea, I would say. China could have the capability to shut down North Korea. They haven't done that. The relationship has been complex. There have been ups and there have been downs. And this has been a symbiotic relationship. Kim Il-sung and his partisans were fighting alongside the Chinese communists against the Japanese. This is, after all, the myth of genesis of the DPRK and the Kim family regime, the independence struggle, where a small skirmish or an attack on a small Japanese police station was presented as the Thermopylae of Kim Il-sung, who single-handedly defeated the Empire of Japan. Forget about the United States. They were nowhere to be found in the Pacific. So again, this is a very powerful myth. That group of partisans created the Korean Workers' Party, or took it to the next level pretty much. And throughout that process, China and the DPRK were in a symbiotic relationship.
And that's still the case, clearly. Is it also the case, Greg, that the Chinese find it expedient to have the North Koreans be a problem for the United States in particular, the South Korean government, the Japanese and others? Because we're often told, of course, as you know very well, that if we want to have a breakthrough with the North Koreans to get rid of, for example, that nuclear arsenal of theirs, we have to have the help of the Chinese. And for that matter, we have to pay in various ways for the Chinese to provide that help, diplomatic help, economic assistance, and other kinds of inducements. As a practical matter, is there any evidence that the Chinese are prepared to bring any significant pressure to bear on the North Koreans to behave better or to disarm? Or are they really intent on perpetuating this arrangement because they are able to exploit it against the West?
There is no incentive whatsoever. To China, North Korea is a thorn in our side, in the side of the United States. And that is truly the utility of North Korea to China. Of course, to China, North Korea is a buffer zone between China and the capitalist Democratic Republic of Korea, South Korea. Of course, North Korea is a bargaining chip and a satellite, a vassal state. After all, this is China's only formal ally, one might argue. Also, the Chinese fought the Korean War for the North Koreans. There is right now a very controversial movie worshiping the greatness of
a
the so-called
revisionist history.
A revisionist history. It's a revisionist
this
worldview.
Thermopylae story that you talked about in North Korea as well.
Absolutely, yes. But as far as I'm concerned, I see no Chinese intention to transform North Korea for as long as Kim Jong-un keeps his act together, for as long as there is no chaos or massive refugee inflows into China. He will stay in power as far as the Chinese are concerned. I work with international organizations quite a bit, with UN agencies. We always see the Chinese on the North Korean side. They're always the great protector of the North Koreans, together with others, together with the Russians, the Venezuelans, the Cubans, Belarus, Vietnam, you name them. But
the Rogues Gallery.
The Rogues Gallery, the friends and beacons of freedom and democracy, right? But there is clear and pretty much unconditional Chinese protection at the UN and other international organizations.
And just so we're clear, the character of the relationship is clearly of the great power and a vassal state. Is that right? I mean, we sometimes hear that the North Koreans have the ability to, exercise some, if not complete freedom of action, they can behave in a way that the Chinese might be surprised at or disapprove of. Is that, well, the Japanese would call it kabuki theater, or is there some real latitude there for them to be independent in any appreciable way?
Running a dynasty is very tough business, and this is what the North Koreans have been doing. They have their 1.2 million men and women in uniform. They have their nuclear weapons, their ballistic missiles, and all of the other gear.
Thanks in no small measure to the Chinese Communist Party again.
That enabled, of course, these developments. They will sometimes stand up and say what they want to say. Senior officials who defected will tell you that during their ideological training sessions, they're told that the Chinese have betrayed the cause of communism, but they will know their boundaries. These will not be fundamental differences because they understand that the very survival of the Kim regime also depends on the support received from the imperial power, from the Chinese.
I want to talk with you more in our next segment about what some of these defectors are experiencing at the moment in South Korea. But to wrap this discussion up, we've just got a couple of minutes left, Greg, but why should we here in the United States care about the condition of the people of North Korea? I'm fond of observing that a country that treats its own people as horrifically as the North Korean regime does its, or for that matter, the Chinese Communist Party does the people of China, is unlikely to treat ours with kid gloves. But what's your answer to that question about why human rights in North Korea should matter to all of us?
If the 20th and the 21st centuries, the age of industrial warfare, have taught us a lesson, that lesson is that when despots who violate the rights of their people and treat them like dirt, abusing them the way that the Kim regime has been abusing the people of North Korea, when such regimes are endowed with weapons of mass destruction, they end up being a serious regional and global threat. Right. This argument can be made also on multiple levels. It is ethically, morally, religiously, and politically the right thing to do. 38,000 American servicemen sacrificed themselves for the sake of safeguarding the Republic of Korea. How has that experiment turned out? Pretty well. The world's 10th largest economy, a true success story. How has the other experiment turned out? What we see in North Korea today is a black hole of human rights. These are almost 25 million human beings, the brothers and sisters of Koreans living in the South. We cannot forget, because remembering them and doing our very best to bring human rights and freedom to the people of North Korea, caring, I think, is a fundamental part of our identity as Americans. As a naturalized American who grew up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, I want to believe, and I believe, that this is indeed part of our fundamental identity.
Yeah. I so admire people like you, Greg Scarleto. I call them foreign-born American patriots, because I think what you appreciate, you and people like you, is what is magnificent about this country and the freedoms that altogether too many of us who had the privilege of being born here and grown up here take for granted. And we fail to appreciate not only what a blessing it is to enjoy these freedoms, but how perishable they are, how fleeting this can be. And your work on behalf of people who yearn for freedom, I'm sure of it, and may not ever experience it in our lifetimes, but still will aspire for it, deserve our help, deserve our support, and deserve to be understood to be victims of something that the communists over there and here have in mind for all of us if they have their chance. Greg, we'll look forward to continuing our conversation with you and talking a bit more about a particularly troublesome piece of legislation, H.R. 3446, which could make the lot in life of the people of South Korea a lot more like that of the North Koreans. We'll be talking about that and much more straight ahead.